Good morning, faithful listener. You are listening to the Bible Explained podcast, where the Bible gets explained. So grab your cup of coffee and stay tuned as we read through the book of Deuteronomy. Hello and good morning, friends and faithful listeners, and thank you so much for tuning in to the first episode of Season 5. I took a couple days off from the podcast, and I hope that you guys are ready to jump back into a brand new book of the Bible, Deuteronomy. If I could learn how to spell Deuteronomy, that would be great. It's kind of a strange spelling for me, but yeah, obviously I have to know how to spell it if I'm going to describe what it is in the show notes of the podcast episodes. But I learned what Deuteronomy means, and Deuteronomy actually means a repeat of, or a second explaining, basically. And that kind of gives the gist of the entire book, really. This is basically just Moses re-explaining the law to the new generation of people. Because don't forget, the older generation had died in the wilderness because of their disbelief. So now this new generation is here, the children, and they are ready to take the promised land. So Moses, of course, is re-explaining God's laws to the new generation, filling in any gaps or things that they might not understand, almost in his own words in a way. Of course, all of this was according to Yahweh. This was not just a Moses thing. This was re-explaining God's laws, and Yahweh was there with Moses while he was doing this. It's pretty clear that it says that in the third verse, but we'll move into that in a few minutes. But I just want to ask you guys how you've been for the past couple days. It was definitely really weird for me to not be doing podcast episodes. And I took one day off last week, and I ended up regretting it. My schedule is weird because I work from home, but then I also work at my church. So my schedule is kind of odd. So I kind of just work when I kind of feel like working, if I'm being honest. But that creates problems because I work every single day, just in different increments depending on the day. So I ended up taking an entire day off on Tuesday, and I regretted it because I was behind the entire rest of the week. Isn't that how it goes? Oh, by the way, happy Halloween. I did a Halloween video, which is up on YouTube right now, so go check that out. It's talking about the origins of Halloween and if Christians should celebrate Halloween or not. So check that out. Go over to the YouTube page. I have it linked in the bio of this podcast episode. But enough chit chat from me. Let's go ahead and start in Deuteronomy 1, verses 1 through 18. Grab your Bible and your cup of coffee. Read along with me. But of course, I'll be reading out of the WEB version this morning. Feel free to grab the version you prefer to read out of. And let's jump right in to Deuteronomy and Season 5 of the podcast. These are the words which Moses spoke to all of Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. It is an 11 days journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 14th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that Yahweh had given him in commandment to them. After he had struck Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth at Edrei. Beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses began to declare this law, saying, Yahweh our God spoke to us in Horeb, saying, You have lived long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey and go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all the places near there, in the Arabah, in the hill country, in the lowland, in the south by the seashore, and in the land of the Canaanites, and in Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to give them to your offspring after them. I spoke to you at that time, saying, I am not able to bear you myself alone. Yahweh your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as the stars of the sky for multitude. Yahweh the God of your fathers make you 1,000 times as many as you are, and bless you as he promised you. How can I myself alone bear your problems, your burdens, and your strife? Take wise men of understanding who are respected among your tribes, and I will make them heads over you. You answered me and said, The thing which you have spoken is good to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, wise and respected men, and made them heads over you, captains of thousands, captains of hundreds, captains of 50s, captains of 10s, and officers according to your tribes. I commanded your judges at that time, saying, hear cases between your brothers and judge righteously between a man and his brother, and the foreigner who is living with him. You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. The case that is too hard for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it. I commanded you at that time all the things which you should do. So in verses 1 through 3, it basically says that Moses is about to give these commandments to the people. For example, here in verse 3, in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that Yahweh had given him in commandment to them. I'm really sorry. I think I read, when I initially read this, I'm pretty sure I read the 14th year, but it's definitely the 40th year. So sorry about that. Yeah, it's not the 14th year. This is like at the end of Moses' life. So Moses is still alive. We kind of left off in Numbers wondering if he was going to die or not, because God had already told Moses that he was going to die, because he was going to die in the wilderness with everybody else who had rebelled in the wilderness. That was Moses' punishment for what he had done. So he was, in fact, going to die in the wilderness. God had told him that already, but it seems like this is Moses' last little spiel almost before he dies. Just making sure that the new generation knows about their history, knows about God, knows about the laws, knows about each other and their own sin nature. That's kind of why Deuteronomy exists. And I'm going to be honest with you, when I first started reading the Bible years ago, I never understood why there was a repeat of the law. I was always like, man, they have Leviticus. Like, why do we have to have Deuteronomy too? Like, I know there's a couple new laws in there, but even so, like, why do we have to have a whole new book repeating the laws? It's because it was very necessary. It was necessary if you look at it historically, and this brings Moses's own feelings into things. And Moses begins to describe how to love God. That kind of feeling that Moses presents really hits home with the Israelites, and not just with the Israelites, but everybody who's about to read Deuteronomy and maybe wonder why there's a repeat of the law in there, like I did. It's a wonderful book that fills in the gaps and has Moses' personality just like written all over it, basically. So he starts in verse 6 with talking about how the rebellion happened, like the Great Rebellion. There was several rebellions. There was one with the golden calf, which Moses did not mention here. That was like the first the first big rebellion. There was a couple little rebellions before that also. That was the first big rebellion, but the biggest rebellion happened here, what Moses is about to describe. And obviously we'll go into that on Wednesday. But yeah, Moses is kind of laying the groundwork, the foundation of what he's trying to present to the people here. So he says, like from the beginning here, God promised the land to you. He promised it through your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So yeah, he's just laying the foundation here. Moses is building on the past to talk about the present and the future for the Israelites. I really like this verse here, verse 11. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times as many as you are and bless you as he has promised you. See, like right there, that's just another verse where we see Moses' personality just like oozing out of this book. You know, right there, he loved his Israelite brothers and sisters so much, and you can see that with how he's speaking to them. He just kind of describes how the Israelite nation got founded, but not just the nation, how their judges got put in place, how the court systems in a way got put in place, kind of a old-fashioned court system. And he talks about the judges here and how Moses just couldn't do it all. Even though God had appointed Moses to run things, Eventually, Moses needed help. And even God recognized that because one of the episodes I did a while back, we talked about how God put his spirit on, I think it was like 50 other men. Or no, I'm sorry, I think it was like 80 other men. God had put his spirit on 80 other men who were going to help Moses because Moses just desperately needed help with the Israelites at that time period. So yeah, even God recognized that Moses was just a man. He was an ordinary person who needed help the same as anybody else. So he describes how the judges got founded here. And I think this is interesting how he kind of goes into the judges a little bit, verses 16 through 18. I commanded your judges at that time, saying, hear cases between your brothers and judge righteously between a man and his brother and the foreigner who is living with him. You shall not show partiality in judgment, and you shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. I just love those verses because there's another thing where that wasn't really described too much in the last couple books. Moses goes really in depth here with the level of not partiality that the judges were supposed to show. So whether or not a person was a foreigner or a rich man who was Jewish living in the city, it didn't matter. That judge needed to show no partiality whatsoever. And that's the point of a judge. The point of a judge is basically to hear both sides of the story and decide what is right or what is wrong. That's the point of a judge. So of course, judges were supposed to be not partial. And unfortunately, we do know that judges are pretty partial. You know how voting season is coming up? Well, anyway, my husband got an absentee ballot in the mail and he voted early. And so he was looking up all these like different people when he was voting to decide who he wanted to vote for. And what was interesting was that there's not a lot of information on the judges in this country. There's very little information on them, who they voted for or what their policies are. And to me, I kind of feel like the judges, you need to know what the judges stand for, because judges will be partial to certain beliefs that they have. They will. And that's not the point of a judge. The point of the judge is to be impartial. But that aside, Moses makes it very clear what the judges were supposed to do. And this is a very important couple of verses because after Moses dies, the judges are what's next. We're going to be going into so many judges in the next few books because that is the system Israel had. Until they had the king, they had judges. Definitely important for Moses to describe what judges are supposed to be and what they're supposed to do so early on in the book of Deuteronomy. But yeah, I mean, he just ends it here in verse 18 by saying, I commanded you at that time all the things which you should do. So I think that's funny that Moses sort of ends it with an I told you so. He's kind of like, I told you guys all this. Because what he's going to go into next is the rebellion. Like, that's the next thing. So we're going to talk about that on Wednesday. We're going to finish up Deuteronomy 1 and talk about the Great Rebellion. So yeah, that'll be a fun episode. And I know you guys have already heard it if you've been on the podcast for a while. However, this one is going to go in a kind of different direction, I believe, regarding the rebellion. So definitely tune in on Wednesday to hear more about that. But also tune in tomorrow, because on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I do a New Testament episode out of the book of Luke. And we're almost done with Luke. Like, we only have a couple more chapters of Luke before we are in the book of John. So yeah, lots of good stuff happening on the podcast and just with P40 Ministries in general, which is the ministry behind this podcast. But I hope to see you guys bright and early tomorrow for an episode out of Luke. I can't even remember what day it is, let alone what podcast episode I'm doing. But thanks guys so much for tuning into this episode, and I'll see you tomorrow. Happy listening, and God bless.